A few weeks ago, we inherited this lathe, but I have nowhere for it to go, so I decided to build a workbench here in my garage. This is the original design I came up with, using standard timber sizes. 4x4s for the legs, 2x4s for the rails, and 2x6s or 2x8s for the top. The load is transferred directly from the top onto the legs, which are then supporting the entire structure in compression. The rails are really just there to hold the legs square. All the joints are simple half-lap joints, which I didn't bother modelling. I wasn't too bothered about which planks I used for the top, so I was going to go with whichever was cheapest. I designed it in OpenSCAD because that's more in line with how I think about 3D models. Since I wasn't sure on things like how many legs it would need, this also made it easy to build up the design programmatically and expose various parameters to play about with until the design felt right. I also thought I might be able to build a cut list by tracking the lengths of the various timber sizes through the code directly in OpenSCAD, but it turns out variables in OpenSCAD are bound to expressions and keep a single value during their entire lifetime. They're essentially constant and can't be updated. I got around this by just logging each length to console as I used it in the program, then doing a bit of manual processing on the output from the console to work out each length. Maybe one day I'll look at submitting a pull request to OpenSCAD to allow a different type of variable for analytical purposes as the model builds. Or maybe I won't bother, who knows. Now that I have the length of timber I need for my desk, the next step is to check a few local timber merchants and buy it all. Is what I would say if it wasn't for a stroke of sheer luck. The day before I was planning on going out and buying the wood, we got a piece of equipment delivered to work and it arrived on this massive pallet. I asked what was happening to it, and apparently a company was going to pick it up and take it to landfill. I called dibs, we told the guys delivering it that we don't need them to take it away, and I got to work breaking it up into lengths so I could get it home. I didn't have chance to set a camera up, so I don't have any footage of it, but that's probably for the best. It was a warm day and I'm not a slight man, so by the end of it I looked like I'd been swimming with all my clothes on. I spent the afternoon breaking the pallet up, cutting to rough lengths that I could transport home, and burning to a crisp. Once I'd done that, I brought the lot home and took stock of what I'd ended up with. The foreman also had to inspect it all. Obviously these aren't the same dimension beams as I'd originally planned to use in my design, but the wood was free, and free is my favourite price to pay for wood. Also the foreman got bored at some point and found a plant pot to play with. I went back to CAD and updated my design to account for the wood that I'd got from the pallet. What I ended up with was lengths of rough cut timber with dimensions of 115 by 115 mm, 95 by 95 mm, 75 by 75 mm, and 90 by 75 mm. I decided to use the 115 square lengths for the legs, since they're taking all the load, and the 95 square lengths for the rails on the sides. For the top, I recovered a lot of slats from the pallet, so I went for a completely different design with slats running across the short depth of the bench instead of planks running the length. I didn't bother modelling this, and it's a chunk more work to do, but hey, it was free. One key consideration in this design is that the beams for my main rails running the length of the bench aren't long enough to do in one piece. I ended up having to have the rails in two parts that meet in the middle. To support the ends of these beams, I needed to have an odd number of pairs of legs so that there's always one in the middle. Now that I have the design, it was time to start preparing the wood. This all came from a pallet, so it was full of nails and bolts that needed removing. It was hard and boring work, but unfortunately necessary. It also gave me a chance to properly inspect the timber and select the best lengths for my bench. Some of the beams had nails that were missing heads, which made them tricky to remove. Maybe at some point I'll get some kind of clamp on them and pull them out, but for now those lengths have been relegated to the pile of future project wood. Some of these pieces had particularly long nails, which were quite tricky to remove. The general process for these is to knock the point of the nail back into the wood to expose the head, and then pull it out with the claw of a hammer or crowbar. It's generally easier if you can pull the nails straight up, so because of the length of these nails, I had to pull a section up, then chock the pivot of the crowbar so that the lever of the claw was moving up rather than sideways. To get the pallet disassembled in a timely manner, I cut a lot of the slats off where they were nailed, so I had to go through and pull a lot of these nubbins off. I don't really have a use for these really small bits, but my sister will use them as fuel in her wood burning stove. Some of the bigger sections still had slats connecting some of the longer beams, so these also needed to be removed and any leftover nails dealt with. Now that I have all the wood prepared and ready to use, I need to cut it all to length. From the CAD, I was able to put the final dimensions in and get a list of the actual cut lengths needed. This was 950mm long for the legs and 270mm long for the cross members, both out of the chunkier 115mm square beams. Then 1700mm long for the rails out of the 95mm square beams. To cut these, I borrowed my dad's sliding mitre saw. The only issue is that it doesn't cut deep enough to go all the way through the thicker beams. I ended up having to cut as far through as possible, then flip the beam over and finish the cut from the other side. This wasn't a huge issue, it just made everything take a bit longer. For each of the beams, I started by facing off one end to get it square. Then I measured my lengths that needed cutting and got to work. These cuts don't need to be super accurate. The entire purpose of this workbench is somewhere to bolt my lathe to, so I'm not going to bother levelling it all properly. As long as it's sturdy, I'll be happy. Once all my wood was to length, the next step was to cut the slots for the half lap joints. I went back to my cut list and worked out all the dimensions for the slots. The legs need a slot for the rail to fit in, and the rails need a slot for the leg. I want the rails in the finished bench to be flush with the legs, so I calculated accordingly. My plan was to cut reliefs in the wood along the section that needs a slot, then remove those thin blades of wood with a chisel and tidy up the surface to get a reasonable finish. I didn't want to have to cut more lengths of wood, so I took an offcut from one of the legs to do a quick test. This chisel, by the way, came with my lathe. You may have noticed it once used to be a file. This caught me out when I first brought it home. I tried to use it as a file, not realising it had been converted to a death trap, and I nearly lost a finger. I found that with the dead stop on the miter saw set, the blade didn't cut all the way to the back of the workpiece. I ended up using a few leftover slats to pack behind the workpiece, so that the cut ended up being the same depth all the way across the slot. Once I was happy that the cuts were going to be clean, I set the depth of the saw blade using the dead stop. This took a few test cuts and iterations to get right, but once I was happy with it, it didn't need adjusting again. Both size slots I need to cut use the same dead stop setting. With all that out the way, I cut one last test slot in each of the two wood types I had so that I could test the actual fit, and then it was time to put slots in the rest of the beams. This followed the same pattern for each one. Mark out where the slots need to go, cut as many blades as I feel I need, knock the blades out and clean up the surface. After I'd done some of the legs, I decided it'd be more efficient to do everything in batches. I decided to mark everything up, then cut all the slots, then remove the excess wood and tidy it up. I think this did help. I feel like I wasted less time switching between tools and I could get into more of a flow. I was probably more fastidious than I really needed to be when tidying up the surface. I spent quite a lot of time trying to knock down all the high spots as accurately as I could, when in reality it didn't matter too much. Once all the wood was cut, it was finally time to start assembling this thing. To get it through the door of the garage, I'll need to take the pieces in one at a time and do the actual final assembly inside. I decided to build the legs first and then tack them together with a cursory screw just to hold them in place while I'm building the rest of the bench around it. A single screw through each leg into the cross brace should be plenty. This is only needed so the things don't fall apart before I get the prop screws in, which will actually hold them together. Of course, now that we're getting a bit further through the build, the foreman had to come and inspect the work. Now that we have all of the leg sub-assemblies, we can do a test fit. I didn't want to squeeze it all into the garage and then find out it didn't fit, but luckily the design at this stage can stand freely without any fasteners, so I built it up outside. Because of the tolerances of the wood, some rails fit better with some leg sections than others. I rearranged a few of them until I got a nice fit, and one of the rails needed a slot widening, so I just did this by hand with my pull saw. After all that, the frame fit together quite nicely. It's at this point in a project where you first start to see it turn from a pile of parts to starting to resemble the finished product that really gives you the kick and motivation you need to see it through. Since I now essentially had a matched set, and all these pieces need to go back together in the same order, I numbered each beam so that I could easily reassemble it once it was inside. I number the leg sections 1 through 5 and the rails 1 through 8. I should be able to work out which ones are the legs and which ones are the rails once they're in, but luckily the foreman's been taking notes, so I can always ask him if I get stuck. Some of these rails are about as straight as a pillow fight round Julie and Clary's house, so the screws I chose are only threaded part way down. The unthreaded shank extends the full depth of the rail so I can drive the screw into the leg assembly and it should pull the rails into line. If I'd wanted it to be even more secure, I could have counterbored the hole so that the head was buried further into the wood, meaning the shank also encompassed the vertical part of the leg and the threads were only in the crossbeam. This would have pulled the leg in too, but I felt like it probably didn't need it and decided to just screw straight into the rails. This is where the bench is going to go in my garage. First thing I need to do is clear all this crap out. I'll have to figure out where to put it all again once the bench is in, but that feels like a problem for future me. For now, since the weather's holding off, I can just stick it all in my garden. I probably need to get rid of a lot of this stuff. As you can probably tell from my physique, this exercise bike gets about as much use as the condom machine in the men's toilets of the Vatican. Also, this is the driver's seat for my Nissan Micra. I've never owned a Nissan Micra, but hey, maybe it'll come in handy for a future project. With the space cleared out, I could bring in the bench and reassemble it. I borrowed an impact driver for the screws. This was so much easier than trying to do it with my drill driver. I could really get the torque I needed to fully drive the screws home and nip everything up. Annoyingly, my bit holder did fail halfway through this, so I had to run out and grab a new one to finish it up. After the frame was screwed together, all that remained was the top. I wanted the top to go all the way to the back wall. The frame actually sits off the wall slightly because of these pillars, but I could definitely see me losing all sorts down the back of there, so the top overhangs the back slightly. Screwing the top on would have taken ages, and I just wanted to get finished at this point, so I decided to nail the slats on. When I got to the pillars, I had to strategically pick planks that fit nicely. I didn't want to have to start splitting slats to fit them in, and I had plenty to pick from, so it wasn't too difficult. I didn't bother cutting any of the slats before I put them on, since I wanted to follow the natural run out of the wall. Once they were all on, I just cut them to size with a circular saw. I measured the overhang on both ends of the bench, then used a string as a guide to mark out the actual cut line. Then it was as straightforward as following the cut line with the saw. This also kicked up a ton of sawdust, so after a quick tidy around with the vacuum, the bench was finally complete. The final thing to do was get the machines on there. That, after all, was the entire reason for building this thing. I found space for this big ass motor, which will become a disc sander once I make a sanding disc for it, my drill press, and of course the lathe that inspired the whole project. The sander has a pulley wheel on it too, so maybe someday I'll build something to go on the end of the bench that can be powered from that. Another thing I inherited was this table saw. It looks quite nice and it's already mounted to its own table, but it needs a bit of TLC before it's really usable, so maybe I'll do a video about that when I get round to it. In the near future, I'm going to use some more slats from the pallet to put a shelf across the bottom of the bench. That should give me some more space to hoard stuff, but I'll tackle that another day. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this bench has turned out. It took way longer than expected. Between having to dodge bad weather and only having a few free hours to work on it at a time, it dragged out a bit more than I'd have liked. But now that it's done, I feel like I've really achieved something. Now I just need to learn how to use this lathe.